Okay, so welcome to this webinar hosted by the Center for Higher Education Research and Evaluation at Lancaster University. It is great to see such big turnout. This time we are hosting our speaker Adam Matthews from Birmingham University. He is a postdoctoral researcher in the process of completing his PhD with the title A Genealogy of the Idea of the University, Past, Present and Future. So Adam has already published a lot as his PhD is in the alternative format, and his focus is on corpus-assisted discourse analysis of the UK institutional documents, such as regulatory statements, prospectuses, mission statements, and so on. I can assure you very good reading and excellent research. It is an honor to host you today, Adam. It's a really interesting topic and quite an impressive endeavor of going through history in half an hour. Just to say that my name is Janja Kominovic. I am a co-director of the center, and I will be co-chairing this session with my colleague Richard Budd, who is also somewhere here. I see his video is switched off at the moment, but he will come in after Adam's presentation. So I will have to leave a bit before the end, but then Richard will take over to conclude the webinar. Richard has also posted something in the chat area. So Adam's Twitter handle and our center's Twitter handle, if you want to tweet during the event, feel free to do so. So without further ado, I think, Adam, we can give you the floor and you will speak about half an hour and then we'll open the floor for discussion. As I already said, please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat area throughout the webinar.
Thank you, Janja. Thank you for such a kind introduction. I will share my screen and make a start because, as Janja says, we've got 250 years to get through. So let's get started. So, Janja, can I ask you for a nod of the head if you can see my PowerPoint slides? Excellent. So hi everyone. So thanks again for such a great introduction, Janja. So Janja's covered a lot of my introduction in terms of my research. So I'm interested in higher education. Obviously, that's why I'm here. I'm kind of interested in the kind of philosophy of higher education, the whole idea of what it's for, but also coming at that from a technology perspective, but not from a traditional technology perspective. I draw upon philosophy of technology and science and technology studies to do that. I'll be touching on some of that today, and also some of my other research, as Janja says, which draws upon discourse analysis, which uses corpuses of text or corpora of text to analyse kind of the discourse of UK institutions. So we'll get straight into it. So what I'm going to do today is run through kind of the history of the university, really, but that's going to be framed within a genealogy and using Foucault's genealogical method. For those of you in the UK, you're probably familiar with a TV show called Who Do You Think You Are? And that's a genealogy where celebrities are on the show and they look at their family trees. And that can be confusing in terms of the way Foucault kind of talks about a genealogy. There are similarities, but Foucault would not like that comparison of family trees due to the fact that his view is that many institutions and social phenomena are not natural and inevitable. And that's key for the analysis that I'm going to attempt to go through today. So my method for this particular chapter of my PhD thesis is a genealogy, and I think this quote really kind of sums that up. So Foucault, a lot of people attribute to critical discourse analysis, and genealogy does link to that, but it kind of looks at how discourses are built up with a historical perspective. So just briefly reading that quote, genealogy is attempting to go further by tracing possible ways of thinking differently instead of accepting and legitimating what are already truths of our world. The aim is to provide a counter memory that will help subjects recreate the historical and practical conditions of their present existence. And that's a really important point for what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to talk about that in terms of a history of the present. The genealogical method can be fairly contested, and there's a lot of literature around it, and even Foucault kind of decided he didn't like it at one point and went back to it. So it can be used for many different things, and that's kind of my attraction towards the method. Really, it's a fairly creative process where you can kind of use it as a tool, and that's how Foucault would kind of term this. It's a tool to be used. It's not a method. It's definitely a methodology. 3 principles of a genealogical analysis definitely incorporates the role of history, as I've alluded to so far. It sees discourse as knowledge, so discourse in that widest sense, but we come to see it as knowledge that is out there, and that's an important point. And we also look at a broader analysis. So what I am going to try and do in tracing these 250 years is to look outside of the university and what was going on in the wider world as well, which has an impact on the university, of course. And these discourses are productive in that they create the knowledge. We ask who has a voice in those systems of truth, and analysis are often taken for granted. So we're going to look at that institution, whether a university has an essence or are there alternatives. So I'll be going through this in terms of the history of the present, and this quote very much talks to that. So setting out a problem expressed in today's terms and looking back at some of the history around it, and whether we can learn from that and whether we can open that up to look at things not being so essentialized. And the way I'm going to do that is use a provocation. So I'm going to revisit this throughout the talk, but my provocation is going to be: the university degree is knowledge transmission for instrumental future student outcomes removed from research. So that's a very bold statement, and some might say a very sweeping statement, but I'm going to use that as a kind of a place to position myself throughout the talk. Why have I chosen to choose those 2 things? The first one linked into one of my pieces of research, as Janja said, where I look at the teaching excellence framework as a UK policy instrument that has attempted to kind of bring teaching excellence to the forefront. My analysis of that found that the key words that came out of the teaching excellence framework were employment, employability, outcomes, and research, which is where the instrumental perspective of my provocation comes from. And a second piece of work, which I'm currently working on, looks at using a similar process, but to look at research excellence framework submission statements. And a key finding that I'm finding there is research is prioritized over teaching still. You know, that's changing, I think, a little bit, but the research excellence framework often talks about alleviating researchers from teaching so they can get on and do their research. Whilst talking about teaching, we often talk about research working together with teaching to improve that. And I've just put a screenshot there, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if anyone else saw this, but Times Higher Education a few days ago published this article of Mark Griffiths, who is a professor who publishes a paper every 2 days, which is a pretty impressive feat. Read the article if you want to read out more about it. But I think that the kind of the last few words of that sentence are really important there, where he says not being required to do all that much teaching was important. So I'll just quickly revisit that provocation. The university degree is knowledge transmission for instrumental future student outcomes removed from research. And the work I'm going to concentrate on historically is going to be that of John Henry Newman and the idea of the university, Immanuel Kant and the conflict of the faculties, and Clark Kerr's uses of the university. However, it doesn't stop there, and more and more books are written, more and more research about higher education are being written, which is fantastic. So this is a live debate, and it's a debate that kind of gets bigger and bigger. It's not going away, which is great for us as researchers, but hopefully today I can open up some of those ideas and kind of explore a little bit more about what we see as a kind of a essentialized truth of what a university is in contrast to what's gone before. So in terms of our historical perspective, I'm going to start in 1784. And the period of the Enlightenment. And of course, the Enlightenment has many different interpretations, but this for me is a useful encapsulation because it captures much of the thinking and disruption that was not just entering the university, but all walks of life. As I said, I want to kind of look outside of the university and the social phenomena that was going on at the time. And this quote from Kant, who was looking at answering the question of what is the Enlightenment, we can kind of see that we're being asked to know. So the context of this is in knowledge is some way transferred without criticality before this Enlightenment thinking. And a key point to make about this is this quote from Kant now kind of looks fairly straightforward. We'll kind of accept it, but he was taking quite a few risks towards the end of his career in saying this, in that religious and sovereign monarchies were kind of controlling universities quite heavily. So in terms of daring to know and daring to kind of reveal truths was important at the time. And Newman was the same when I can come on to him. So moving from that initial work, which Kant was providing a commentary of the Enlightenment, he also wrote a book in 1798, which took, again, this was one of his last books. I think it was his last one book that Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, wrote. So reading it kind of feels as though he's kind of ending his academic career and he's kind of reflecting on the university, which makes it a quite interesting read, I think. Importantly, he highlights a few things, and as I said, university governance is one thing, university governance and government, there was a tension there. But what he clearly sort of outlines is that there's a conflict which is positive, but he describes a higher and a lower faculty within a university. And the higher faculty looks at instruments of government for civil servant training. So the higher faculty was concerned with theology, law and medicine, which maps directly to the roles of clergymen, magistrates and physicians, with teaching from authorised and agreed sources, which came from the Bible, the law of the land and medical regulations. So here we can kind of see that link to employment and employability. But importantly for Kant, he said that there should be a lower faculty as well. And that lower faculty has freedom to pursue truth without government control, dare to know, as he said in his Enlightenment speech. Kant goes on to say that that a department of this kind must be established at every university to control and guide the higher faculty of utility. So conflict for Kant was good in that the two faculties could work together in healthy debate and a respectful distance. They feed off each other in a way that we may call today theory and practice. So I think we can kind of start to see this kind of idea of critical thinking kind of bringing itself about. But Kant also in the book he talks a lot about universities managing this conflict to ensure it stays healthy and that one doesn't overtake the other. So I'm going to return to my provocation. And although not explicit in Kant's conflict of the faculties, here we can see that the emergence of discovery of new knowledge to be disseminated alongside specific professional knowledge for roles within the government are very important. But Kant talks at length about the narrow nature of education for a specific professional role, but does not deny it. The higher and lower faculty in conflict he saw as new ideas and Enlightenment thinking feeding into professional training. If we sever the two of these in this contemporary university, are we at risk of losing the benefits of those healthy tensions and conflicts, which we may call critical thinking? So I think we can start to see his idea coming across there and very much similarities as to what we're seeing today. And certainly in the UK, what we're seeing is a kind of a government push towards a university degree mapping directly to an employment and a job, where in terms of this Enlightenment thinking, Kant would say, and others, that if we learn about the world primarily, then we will go on to flourish in future life. Moving on to 1852 in our whistle-stop tour of these years, many people will be familiar with Cardinal John Henry Newman's ideal and his idea of a university. So Enlightenment thinking was really key for Newman as well. So Newman was writing this book at a time similar to Charles Darwin, and to start to think about his his theories and ideas, which were anti-religion in many ways. But Cardinal Newman was part of the church, and he wanted to bring Enlightenment thinking into that religious view. And he saw Enlightenment thinking to subvert knowledge as transmission between generations. So that idea of knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and didn't change. Newman was looking to create a university to do that, and he was tasked with designing a new university in Ireland. And this was the book that came out of it, which is based on a set of lectures. He saw cultivation of mind and a liberal education, of universal education. And interestingly, Newman was anti-research within the university. He said that it should be no research and just teaching. Education came first, professionalisation second, and citizenship and good society. His point on research, he says that should happen in other institutions. The university should be teaching. And he often says that the word university is universal, so there's no disciplines either. It was a search for truth. So I want to come back to the provocation in terms of what Newman would say to that. And I think Newman would say, in terms of employability and instrumental future student outcomes, he would say this becomes mechanical. And the mechanical, says Newman, is useful. And life could not go on without this, but this form of instruction is not the place of a university. The opposite of this instruction is education for Newman. Education is not mere reading of books and passing down of knowledge, but a habit, a personal possession of inward endowments. Instruction then for Newman was for manual skills. And those manual skills, again, he thought should be somewhere else. He thought that, again, if the student entered the university, cultivation of mind and a way of thinking, they would go on to flourish in any career. So we can see that this idea is kind of flipped around, that we're not denying that a university degree will help in terms of your future, but first comes the education, and then those skills that you gain will take you into the world of work. So again, very, very relevant, and the argument of severing teaching and research, of course, which is relevant, and I'll come on to that further later. So we move forward to 1810, and many of you will be familiar with Humboldt's innovation of 1810. So again, under that Enlightenment umbrella of that new thinking that was coming around, which kind of subverted domination of knowledge. The German 18th century is described here as being in a pretty bad state in terms of intellectualism. And I think it's quite interesting that it's described as encyclopedic. So that's quite a good term for that passing down of knowledge. But it's passing on knowledge that doesn't change from generation to generation. And what von Humboldt was able to change that. And von Humboldt was in a different position to Kant and Newman, in that he was in a government position. So he was able to enact this ideal in the University of Berlin in 1810. So he established the University of Berlin in 1810, and he bundled those two things together. So in contrast to Newman, he bundled research and teaching together. And the principles of that University of Berlin was higher learning. It was a state institution, but it was a state institution which protected academic freedom. So he set the institution up, but said government should stay away from this. Universities should act as a conscience for the government. So there should be research, but they shouldn't influence what happens within the university, which we now know to be academic freedom. And Bildung is a concept which is often attributed to Humboldt, of that self-formation, cultivation and freedom. And interestingly, teacher as researcher and researcher as teacher, Humboldt saw that one role, lecturer, researcher, and working with students to form new knowledge under that Enlightenment umbrella. So we're going to kind of speak to that provocation in terms of what Humboldt would say about the transmission of knowledge for instrumental future student outcomes removed from research. I think you can probably guess that he would be quite against that. The University of Berlin's ideals put teaching and research hand in hand. for him that they could not be removed, that the student works with an academic to pursue their knowledge. Often the term academic apprenticeship is used to talk about students in this context, and that was for Humboldt what that looked like. So we're gonna move forward to 1963. So those the three thinkers that I've spoken about so far, very much under an Enlightenment umbrella, but we're kind of pushing forward now, kind of post-war into an industrial era, where we have Clark Kerr's multiversity, and in his book The Uses of the University from 1963. It's a really highly cited quote, but I think it's a really good quote to kind of get across what Kerr thought about the university in 1963, especially in California, where he was having a vision for a university, where he said, "I've sometimes thought it is a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over parking." So what he's saying here, and then the second quote kind of shows that, is the university is growing into something that can't be kind of described as teaching and research or one thing. It's the multiversity. One of his quotes that I'm going to read out now kind of portrays that as well, and he uses the term strands of history quite a lot. So he talks about the strands of history that build up on what a university is, and those build from all of those strands that I've spoken about before, and many more, and that's the kind of genealogical method that Foucault would talk about, in terms of we're building up this knowledge of what something is in the present. And in 1963, Kerr said, "The beautiful world was being shattered forever, even as it was being so beautifully portrayed." By 1852, when Newman wrote that German universities were becoming the new model, the democratic and industrial and scientific revolutions were well underway in the Western world. The gentleman at home in any society was soon to be at home in none. Science was beginning to take the place of moral philosophy, research the place of teaching. And that kind of shows that Kerr was foreseeing this new idea of a university that was building upon the Industrial Revolution, and universities starting to partner in the US with agriculture and with science, and kind of pushing that forward in terms of what we'll come on to in terms of the knowledge economy and beyond. So I've taken Kerr's multi-university here as an idea in terms of the University of Birmingham campus. So Kerr would say that the campus is no more an ivory tower. So I'm sure we've all heard the term ivory tower talked disparagingly about universities. He was really trying to dismiss that the university now is part of the city, and he talked of the city as being the city of intellect. So if we were to take the University of Birmingham, where I work as an example, we've got a campus map there, but we're seeing that that's exploding across the city. So there'll be new students joining. So in terms of some of the thinkers that I've spoken about in the Enlightenment, there wasn't many people going to university. So there would be new students joining. So the university had to accommodate that. The merging of universities and industry, working alongside governments for Kerr, connected all parts of society and not separated into those ivory towers. So a key issue for Kerr was that universities were conservative institutions based on what had came in the past, but they were entering this dynamic environment, and he encouraged a more business type approach. And where Kerr was talking about in California, we can see kind of the emergence of partnerships with business. And I think in 1963, the more Kerr talks about the university, you can see in his writing that he's starting to foresee really the emergence of the knowledge economy, and we may call that the neoliberal knowledge economy, where knowledge is a commodification. So Kerr then sets to work on outline the area of change that universities will face in the 1960s and beyond, and he names three. Those are growth, shifting academic emphasis, and the involvement in the life of the society. So this all aligns then to the knowledge economy and the post-industrial landscape. And universities in some ways were thrust into centre stage, I think, because, as I said before, if we look beyond the university, if knowledge is becoming a commodity, the university was kind of looked to as providers of knowledge to kind of provide that. So I think that's interesting, and we may say, did universities have a choice in entering that or not? That's maybe something we can talk about. Kerr was very, very keen on his idea of a multiversity, in that universities can be and should be anything they want to be. And he talks about lots of tensions that go on within universities. And some of those tensions can include teaching and research, student satisfaction, industry partnerships, many roles and organisations that are involved. And we'll talk about unbundling very briefly shortly. But he talks a lot about leadership, and how leadership of universities is vital to keep this ever-growing, ever bigger group of people kind of aligned and having those mission values, but also having that conflict. So the conflict that Kant talked about is healthy in terms of a debate, an academic debate, and kind of producing knowledge in such a critical manner. So that provocation in terms of Clark Kerr and the multiversity, Kerr raised concerns as the university grew that academics were more interested in research than teaching. And this is something he mentions a few times, as research becomes the primary commodity in the knowledge economy. That was where emphasis was going. Technology as well for Kerr was important. So he starts to talk about technology being key not only for the dissemination of knowledge, but also technology as a force in industry which universities should be involved with. And Kerr quotes in 1963 the San Francisco Bay Area developing such institutions, and that Bay Area now has a huge technology base and responsible for many technologies used globally in institutions such as Stanford and Berkeley, which created an environment and a workforce for technology companies in Silicon Valley, such as Apple and Google. So he would have very much, I think, been for the idea of working in partnership with industry, but also universities kind of taking a partnership approach in that, and definitely research being part of that. We're getting towards the future now, so I'm very wary of time. So we're going to kind of just bring us up to the present day now, and the unbundled digital university of the future. So the idea of an unbundled university is a growing research area. If people haven't come across it, very, very briefly, the way I often explain it is it's how you may see a holiday. So in the past, a holiday, you may walk into your travel agent and pay for a holiday, which includes everything. Unbundling that may say that you buy your flight separately, your accommodation separately, your transfers. So it's a business model that looks to do that. This can take many forms, but in the university, I think we're seeing it grow, and a very interesting research area. To put it into a little bit of context, again, looking from a historical perspective, there's a really interesting paper from Wang 1975 that was talking about the unbundled university. And Wang, talking from a legal perspective, said that there's four aspects to a university education, and that is the impartation of information, which is teaching, accreditation, which is assessment, coercion, which makes you as a student kind of get you through your degree, and club membership, which is social capital, connections, and alumni. And he said that why aren't those four things separate? Why don't we break that up and have separate institutions doing those? So we can kind of see a familiarity here, sorry, with Clark's multiversity, this growing university, which is having more and more people involved. And why not break all those bits up and get specialists to do that? Unbundling and bundling comes with professional identity as well. So this speaks to that growing university. If you do work in a university, I'm sure you'll know that there's a huge amount of roles as now which go towards part of a university. And there's a literature review which I cite here, which looks at this idea of unbundling, and there's kind of two extremes really. There's the uncritical good, which kind of says it's a good thing because professionals will work together to provide university services, but also wholesale bad, which says we're looking at a deprofessionalisation of the teacher and researcher, external profit of companies coming in. Those might be digital companies, they may be other service providers, and professional specialist skills in collaboration, and also efficiencies. So we can kind of see that there's a kind of a good and bad to this idea of unbundling, but very similar to what Kerr talked about. So let's return to that kind of present provocation. The university agrees knowledge transmission for instrumental future student outcomes removed from research. So digital technologies by their very nature are transmission. So if we're talking about unbundling services to digital companies, for example, in this perspective, I think there's a metaphor there which digital are kind of bits and bytes, that they are a transmission. So we could fall into that trap potentially of making it an instrumental knowledge transmission, of putting everything online. And if we're unbundling different roles within the university, teaching and research certainly could be one of those. But also I'd like to make that a little bit broader, in that around the university we have many careers, and many professional careers with different perspectives. So just noting down a few earlier, I came up with IT, we've got careers, we've got marketing, we've got educational development departments, we've got alumni relations, we've got business collaboration, and they all kind of work together with academics, which change kind of some of the priorities potentially, but also working together. How does that work? That is very different to Humboldt's vision of that teacher researcher working independently with students. So just before I finish, taking that idea of technology, which is often attributed to unbundling, I don't think it is technology per se. I think technology is one aspect of it. And I think a good way of looking at that, Andrew Feenberg, who's a philosopher of technology, has written a book called The Techno System, where he says it's not necessarily technology as an acting thing on its own. And he uses the internet as an example, where he talks about the internet as consumption, where we may see that as a transmission of knowledge. We may watch a bunch of videos and say, we've learned stuff. Or internet as a community, where it's more of a collaboration between academics, students, and others within the university. And I think that quote that on screen kind of speaks to that. So keeping an open mind about the internet is not a naive, uncritical stance, but on the contrary makes possible political engagement with its future. And he talks of the techno system as technology, but also administrations in terms of governance and leadership, just like Kerr did within the university, but also markets as well. There's markets out there that are kind of defining this. So market making in terms of digital companies, certainly during the pandemic, who can provide digital services for the university. How does that fit in with the vision of what the university is? And an example of that Feenberg uses is, we could use technology to have a cohort of students on a module which are 500 students with a lot of transmission of knowledge, or we could have 10 people from all over the globe which use the internet as a community, and the teaching experience is very different. So I think essentializing technology in the unbundled digital university is a problem, and we should kind of critically look at that. So that was the 250 years. I just wanted to flip back to the kind of why I did that. So the genealogy aspect. So just saying that genealogy is attempting to further trace possible ways of thinking differently instead of accepting and legitimating what are already truths of our world. So what we may think of as the university as one particular thing, we can kind of challenge that. And hopefully by talking about the past and digging some of those things up, we can kind of talk about that history of the present to maybe look to the future. So in conclusion, of those 250 years, we had the Enlightenment as a disruption to society. Enlightenment thinking came in, and Kant, Newman and Humboldt really ran with that and brought those into universities. Kerr looked at the multiversity in the US, building upon those foundations from those thinkers and the Enlightenment, but kind of brought that into to industry and how the university in the US developed. Knowledge socially becomes a commodity, and universities are thrust into that marketplace and have almost got no option but to grow. They're part of that. And then neoliberal policy has further commodified knowledge and a university education. And now, as we are at the moment, where we've got digital technologies influencing further, but not really acting independently, as we may see. I think a quote that we'll often hear is technology will change the university. And I think that talks of technology as a thing and not academic students, university leaders. So I think that's an interesting provocation going forward. And finally, some tools to kind of look at the university of the future. I think the post anything, maybe we are at the post university, but I think post digital and post-humanism are opportunities to look at what's gone on in the past and how can we improve that. Critical theory and critical pedagogy are really important. And also from my own area of research, design theory. So design theory looks at taking something and creating something from nothing. And so my idea there is how can we think, how designers think in terms of what we want the university to look like, and how can we accommodate all of those different perspectives, whether they're from inside the university or whether they're from outside the university. So the question remains, what are the alternatives? That's the tricky bit. I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but hopefully that has kind of opened up some of the debate for us to kind of take that forward.
All right. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Adam, for this fascinating time travel. It was very impressive, I must say. There's also claps from the audience. So there has been some chatter in the chat area, but just to say again that because there are less participants than registered, we will be able to allow people to actually speak very briefly. If you want to, please either raise your hand or somehow otherwise indicate you would like to speak. If not, you can post your comments and questions in the chat area, and then Richard and I will read them out loud. So there was a discussion, Adam, in the chat area around basically the sources that you used. Let me just, I think that a lot of them are quite connected. So let me just try to kind of summarize them all. So it was said that it's interesting that we've had a more than 100-year gap between Kant, Humboldt, Newman, and Kerr. And people are wondering what kinds of writing about higher education was going on during these times. And there was also another question from how you selected these texts that you selected. Why these and why these years? People also suggested other possible authors, such as Thorsten Veblen or Durkheim, and the French models of the university. So it's really an interest around how you selected these thinkers and why.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, obviously there's a huge amount out there. I kind of went with reviewing a lot of literature, but I think those three kind of social movements kind of stood out for me. So the Enlightenment, the kind of industrial revolution, and then that post-industrial move to kind of a knowledge economy. Those were the three that I sort of focused on. Of course, there were a huge amount of writers and thinkers that I could have chosen, but those are the ones that kind of felt like they told the story, but also kind of that history of the present as well. So when I've been reading through different literature, when something kind of sticks out as kind of really speaking to some of the kind of present issues that we're facing, those were the ones that stood out. So there wasn't necessarily any kind of scientific reason behind that, but there are definitely lots more, and they are quite sort of UK, US focused, of course, as well, and European focused. So I'm sure there's lots of other opportunities to explore other thinkers as well. And I'll be making a note of the people in chat. So thank you for everyone who put the other thinkers in there.
Yeah, just most recently, people also proposed Robert Merton and Michael Oakeshott.
Yeah, Michael Oakeshott is good as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just wondering, in terms of, I appreciate your, endeavor going through thinkers in thinking about the university from the current provocation, but I'm also wondering about the general kind of economic, political, and social order of the time. You're thinking about. So would this be a different approach, genealogical approach, if you were to study the provocation, through this kind of analysis of the economy or economic order and social order and the political order of the time? Or would, I mean, obviously, thinkers are embedded in their context and environments anyway, but I still think it would be quite a different approach.
Yeah, I think they definitely embed, and I think one mistake that we may make if we're looking to the university of the future is to just pick up an idea and run with it in the present context. So I think analysing that context is really important, and I think it's really important, I think, to look at, and I think Foucault would say this, to look at that kind of archaeology of knowledge rather than genealogy of the time, in terms of some of the risks that people like Newman and Humboldt and Kant were taking at the time in terms of the political and social environment. It wasn't a position where governments could be criticised so much. And I think by looking at the historical perspective, I think we need to kind of tell the story of the university, because I think in the present time, it's certainly in the UK, the government is not positive about the university as an institution. So not quite as extreme as the past, but I think looking at what we can do now from learning from the past, it's telling the story beyond the university degrees for a job. What can we say about the university more broadly as a social enterprise, as a social function? And I think when you look at the times these thinkers were talking, I think the context is hugely important. And yeah, I think that there's definitely more opportunities to delve into that. You're
mute. Yeah, sorry, I've got a question from Matthew. He said his sound's dodgy, so he's asked me to ask for him. He said, I was interested in your view finding that research is being prioritized over teaching. I've carried out lots of reviews of institutions where teaching, remission, funding and other forms of support are underdeveloped, and it's hard for staff to find the time to carry out that scholarly activity. So is the prioritization of research on paper rather than in practice?
The whole area of the research teaching nexus is a huge area of study and a really fascinating area. So there's that argument: is there a direct correlation between the two? I think this speaks to the unbundling of the university in some ways. So I think if we work in universities, we'll know that there's teaching focused roles, there's research focused roles, but of course, in those teaching roles, staying up to date with what's happening and scholarship is important. So I think if we look at the mission statements of some universities, we will hear that description of a research intensive university where research is the priority, and teaching benefits from that. I think the practice of that might be a little bit different. And yeah, there's a huge amount of research being done around that. There's a paper from Malcolm Tite, who's from Lancaster as well, from 2016, that does a literature review around that. And it's a hugely complex area, but I think more research needs to be done in terms of the way that universities can describe that. And I think going back to the previous point, I think it's talking about what universities are for and talking about diversity of different institutions, which I think is really important. So I've started to do some of that research in terms of a discourse analysis of university documents. I think there's probably a triangulation opportunity there where we take some of that public discourse to find out, well, actually what is happening on the ground. Do those two things match up, or how do those tensions work within the university? And going back to tensions, I think Kerr talks about this at length, and I think again it's really important as universities become bigger. I think that leadership and that kind of mission is really important. And of course they're getting bigger, not just as campuses, but those kind of companies that I was talking about that are coming in to provide services, that there's a kind of influence and attention there. So that academic role is changing, but sometimes maybe the institution doesn't change with it, and maybe we don't even react to that. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting area.
So oh, sorry.
Yeah, we have a question from Peter, who was just going to step in. Peter, where are you?
Hi, Peter.
Oh,
Are you there? Okay, I'll ask for it. So, I mean, there's been a kind of a discussion around the hierarchy of subjects in the universities, and that came back to the higher and lower faculties and kind of the instrumental thing. And we've had there's been a sort of a little bit of a chat around hierarchies of subject disciplines in modern universities in terms of status and influence. And then also particularly the position of the arts and humanities, which at the moment seem to be severely kind of at risk, particularly in certain kinds of institutions. If there's something you could say about that, how that fits into this broader context, because as you mentioned before, the social context around the university is crucial in all of this.
Definitely, and I think so. Again, going back to other writers and thinkers, Martha Nussbaum and those kind of people, really kind of proponents for the arts and the humanities. And I think there's almost becoming a battle, unfortunately, where STEM is kind of that prominent discipline. But I think if we look back to those thinkers, certainly the higher and lower faculty that Kant talked about, that we've got the different disciplines working together in tension. I think that tension is fine. Newman talked about the idea of universal knowledge, and I think interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, I think are really positive things, but I think they're difficult to achieve. I think if we take some of the issues that society is facing, they can't be tackled, I don't think, by one discipline. Unfortunately, universities are set up that way. I see myself as fairly interdisciplinary. I'd see myself as a social scientist, but I work with a lot of computer scientists as well. So sometimes that tension is there, and I think you have to create the environment for that. So I think, firstly, from a macro perspective, from a university leadership perspective, I think there needs to be the support for those arts and humanities and social sciences, and also some of the newer disciplines that are coming in. There's often new disciplines that come in, and Bradotti, from a posthuman perspective, talks about that in terms of the posthuman university. What are the new disciplines come in, or how do the disciplines work together? But there's that leadership and macro perspective. But I think also it's kind of structurally, how do those things work? If the School of Computer Science is one side of campus and I'm in the School of Education on the other side of campus, I have to make quite a bit of effort to go and speak to those people. And when I do speak to them, we often have disciplinary languages that need to be gotten over, and sometimes those clashes happen first and we never speak again. So I think it's trying to pull those together. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but yeah, I think I find it really, really interesting to work across disciplines, but it can be hard work, but we also need the funding to do it as well.
Hi, can I chip in? I think you can hear me now, can you not?
We can. Hi, Peter.
That thing about subject disciplines, which I raised earlier in the chat, again, thinking back about computer studies was the example I had, because I do remember a conversation about whether that was a worthy subject for higher education. I don't know whether there's any research on how disciplines, different subject areas have moved in and out of universities over the last kind of 30, 40 years, because there has been quite a lot of traffic.
Yeah, computer science is an interesting one. I was seeing an article last week, I think it was someone posted it on Twitter, talking about computer science should be a social science. Because of the ubiquity of computing, it shouldn't sit in one particular place. I also work with a lot of engineers, and you sit down, I'm sometimes going a little bit intimidated to work with engineers in the university, but you sit down and they're tackling a lot of the same problems. They're working with fields of psychology, social sciences to do that. So it is interesting when disciplines, the history of disciplines, I think, is an interesting area. I don't know too much about the literature, but I'm sure there are writers that are out there talking about that and how they've come in, how they've crossed as well. So psychology is quite an interesting subject, because in some universities it will be very clinical, and then in some universities you'll find that it's a very social psychology, almost moving into sociology and a little bit of philosophy as well. So sometimes these barriers are problematic, I think, but it's quite a challenge, I think, to try and cross those barriers. But yeah, interesting. Thanks, Peter.
I've got a question that's come in from Nazia. Let me scroll up to find it, which was asking about decolonizing in relation to unbundling. So, of course, it's, you know, as you mentioned before, the three big names in kind of higher education history, at least from the Enlightenment onwards, are all well, white men, right? Of high status and so on. And the question is how decolonizing fits in with the notion of unbundling the university and how that then looks, if you've got a sense of that.
Yeah, I think the unbundled university has got an opportunity to be decolonized, but also that there's almost a risk there as well, because it depends which players get to have that voice. So Foucault would be a good person to go to in terms of who has the power to speak what a university is. And that analysis shows, you know, the analysis of the genealogy of where we are today has been dominated by Western attitudes of, as you say, white elite males. So I think that's a real task for us going forward, to try and bring those different perspectives in. I think I probably could go out and search for alternatives. That may be a nice project to go for next. Some of the names that we don't always hear. So where are some of those fringe ideas coming from that we could throw out as alternatives? And I think that would be definitely a Foucauldian type of approach, just like he did in Discipline and Punish. So who has got the voice to say what a prison is? So I think, yeah, a really good project. And hopefully, if I don't have the time to do it, someone else could take that on. That sounds really interesting.
Okay, great, thanks. Dan, over to you. Next question, please.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. Really, really enjoyable. I'm wondering where, you know, what the risks and benefits are around Enlightenment values. It seems that as you progress through your different thinkers, we get to a kind of widening of the impact of the university and a kind of broadening of the constituency that the university has, you know, positive benefit or value for. And I'm just wondering, do you regard unbundling as a threat to those Enlightenment values, or could it be the next kind of radical widening of mission and impact? Is it fundamentally positive, or how do you see it?
I think the Enlightenment being such a huge thing, that there are people that would say, you know, postmodernists would say that we should sort of reject some of those ideas. And I think that's where posthumanism is quite an interesting project, where we can say, well, what are the benefits that what have we done which is good, but how can we kind of take that forward? I think unbundling, I think as I said in the talk, that the literature reviews are kind of very, very binary opposites. There's wholesale good versus wholesale bad. And I think there is an opportunity to kind of reset that. And I think I was trying to think of some examples of good unbundling today. So I think obviously, I think we can probably all think of examples of bad unbundling, where we have for-profit organisations come into university to sell technology to solve all of our problems. I think that is probably one of the risks. But also unbundling in terms of an academic teaching and researching role, in terms of collaborating. So I was thinking of some projects that I've seen where academics have collaborated with artists to tell the story of their research. I've done some really good work that I've really enjoyed, working with graphic designers and videographers, and those kind of to talk about sort of disseminating research knowledge. So when we talk about developing online courses, I think rather than having this technological AI fix, I think there's this opportunity to bring in professions. And if you work with a really great designer, an artist, I think there's a real opportunity there. So that for me would be kind of unbundling that role a little, and there's certainly a positive there.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. We've got just about time for one more question, and this one's coming from Hannah. So
hi, yes.
Hi.
I work at a students' union, so I'm obsessively concerned with the student experience. So I was just wondering whether there's been any research or findings on the impact of unbundling on student satisfaction, the student experience, potentially in relation to kind of student communities, well-being, identity, things that we know are so integral to students' opinions of their university experience. So I didn't know if there was anything to kind of comment on that.
There's not that I know of, Hannah, but I think it's a really good point. And I think the two sides of the argument there would flick, I think, between that kind of professionalizing and segmenting different perspectives of the university versus kind of that broader one academic role does one thing. And I think Ben Williamson up at Edinburgh does a lot of work around the digital technology companies that come into universities and partner with universities, and some of the effects that may have. I think from a student experience perspective, I think the university have got a real role. If we bring in experts from outside to take a particular, bring in products and services, I think, as Clark Kerr would say, I think the leadership is really important in terms of bringing that together into kind of a seamless experience. I used the term design theory in terms of what we could use going forward. And I think a designer would look at a whole process of a student experience and look at how that worked. And I think the risk is that we have a student engaging with a university to make an application, through going through their degree and all of the huge amount, diverse amount of people that they will come into contact with, versus when they become an alumni and how that works. And there's a lot of discourse now around lifelong learning and what products and services universities can provide for alumni. So I think having that kind of mapped out as a university is really, really important. And I think a danger of unbundling is that can become disjointed.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. I mean, the fact that we've had such wide-ranging questions is kind of a reflection that you've really given us some food for thought. I mean, it's always really important to kind of think about what universities are for, and that there are these competing visions, and how they all balance together or rub against each other is kind of, it's just kind of one of the ongoing questions around HE and what it's for. So thanks a million for that. Feel free, everyone, to take the conversation further on Twitter, or to drop Adam a line, but thank you all very much for coming and for the questions. It was a really, really good session. So lots of great stuff in the chat and in the questions. So thank you, everyone. And this will be recorded, so the recording will be available. So thanks very much and take care.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Adam.